to be a cooperative, you have to abide by the 7 guidelines that were kind of codified in the 90s, but had really been as part of the longer history of cooperation in practice already. So that's democracy, open membership, anyone can join. They have to be independent, which basically means they need to be self-sustaining. They require members to participate. So to cooperate is an activity. It's not a standing by and letting this kind of lovely process wash over you. Education is also a key and important part of rejuvenating and ensuring that the cooperative is sustaining itself. And you also have to have cooperation amongst cooperatives, which links to this idea that AE and others have around trying to cooperativize complete supply chains, and also a wider concern for the community. So cooperation perhaps re-emerges in Ireland during the late 19th century. There are older Irish traditions. The meitheal is one that springs to mind, which is kind of around about the kind of the rural economy, rural society, people helping each other out, particularly around at various points in the kind of the agrarian calendar. I was also thinking about oikonomia, which is where the word economy comes from, and it has an Aristotelian linkage, which is about, and he talks about economia being something that is around managing a household. It has connotations of stewardship, and there is an intrinsic link between ethics and economy. So economies and economic thought is never a value neutral practice, even if sometimes it's presented as such. I also think that I open up the space around cooperation in a spiritual way. It kind of brings a different approach to issues of religion as an aspect of the Irish question. I know we always think of religion as being kind of central to some of those kind of sites of conflicts and identity, but thinking about a spiritual approach to planning an economy is not something we really do as often, but I think it is actually an important part of what's going on. So cooperative leaders in Ireland were focused on how farmers might best utilise the land, and focused on, and the idea that they hit on a cooperative approach to this isn't just that this is a convenient tool to best organise those resources. It is an ethical disposition that does have kind of moral connotations, and it is, particularly for people like Finlay and AE, is a moral prescription. So my argument today is essentially that spiritual and economic objectives become deeply entwined for those who are promoting economic reform, and especially cooperative reform. And I want to sketch 2 strands incomprehensively. I won't be able to do these 2 strands full justice, but I want to think about that in terms of neo-scholasticism, and that's where Father Tom comes in, and also theosophy, or perhaps mysticism, which is represented by AE. And I think there's a huge overlap between these 2 when we look at it through the lens of cooperation. So these are essentially types of heterodox economists who have a spiritual critique of capitalism. And this is drawing on a current research and book project that I'm currently working on, which is looking at the way Catholic social teaching is communicated through the Irish diaspora in the same period as a way to critique capitalism. So there's lots on Catholicism as a kind of critique of socialism and then communism during the Cold War. But actually, its kind of sharpest critique prior to the Russian Revolution anyway was around the iniquities of capitalism, because that's what most of them would have been exposed to, which so it kind of makes sense. So the key question then, I suppose, is what role spirituality plays in economic development. And I look at this in the book, I'm going to look at this through the politics of land, through the politics of money, and through the politics of labour and capital, and the kind of the moral prescriptions and analyses that are going on there. But I suppose one of the big overarching stories is this is also a story about economic democracy. And it's something that AE places a great deal of emphasis on in his work, the national being. In fact, I think it's one of the central pivot points is his critique of representative democracy only going so far, and if a revolution only delivers a form of representative democracy without actually doing democracy in the economy, it's not really going to help so many of those people who sit outside or don't share in the kind of the centres of wealth. Those people who you were talking about, maybe some of the fallen people, the people on the sidelines, aren't going to enjoy the kind of the positivity of that form of political independence. So, capitalism, what is it? It's a term that's used a lot, and it's also, maybe it's a term a little bit like neoliberalism. It gets used in many, many different situations, and it can sometimes lose its meaning by being applied to every set of situations and problems. The way I'm thinking about it is the way in which these people who I'm studying define it themselves. So the problem of capitalism relates to the fact that it has an acquisitional drive. It concentrates on concentrating capital and resource ownership in the hands of a few. And for those people involved in Catholic social teaching, while the preservation of private property ownership remains a sacred objective, it's not something that should ever trump the interests of the wider community. So in this respect, Irish Catholic social reformers, and I don't want to suggest that these are the mainstream of the Catholic Church either. They're kind of being policed as well by maybe people who would have been up on the hill here in this city. But they are influenced by the emergence of Fabianism in the United Kingdom, the rise of a form of Christian socialism, the waves of progressivism that are evident elsewhere, particularly in the United States. So people like the older Henry Wallace, the grandfather of Henry Wallace, who you mentioned earlier, and who Joan was speaking about at our summer school last year so eloquently. All these people were coming into hove into view for these people in Catholic circles, but obviously through the medium of the cooperative movement as well. One of my key case study people is John Ryan, who was trained as a priest in a seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, actually. So he's a key figure in the book. But he defines the form of capitalism that he spent his career critiquing as representing the dominating characteristics of capitalism having been private ownership and the operation of the means of production directed to the lowest practicable wage payments. And he sees social Catholicism as contained in various papal encyclicals as responding to the inequalities of capitalism through the occupational group system. Not least of its values is its fundamental democracy. Under it, men would be able to order their own economic lives. And some of these questions have been shaped, I guess, through my own kind of involvement in kind of the aspects of my own associational life. So I run a group called the Organic Intellectuals. We're a branch of the Dublin Food Cooperative, and we meet most Saturdays to discuss a various range of issues that are presented by different members. We try and keep it as grassroots as possible. But an issue that does come up recurring, it does recur frequently, is the question about relationships between ecology, food, and spirituality. It's not a question we ever fully resolve, and people have different perspectives on that, and that's one of the things that keeps the meetings rather interesting. One of the ideas that comes up in our discussions around nature and humans' relationship to nature is this idea of dominion or stewardship, whether we have dominion over nature or whether we're here as stewards, and therefore it's a kind of a gift that we have to kind of pass on to future generations. Some of that actually germinating out of the book of Genesis, I guess, in the Bible. But we read recently a lecture that was given in the 1980s by Charlene Spretnek on the promise of green politics and its spiritual dimensions. And her focus on green politics resonated with members of the food co-op, as did this issue of spirituality. And the emphasis was not the same for all members, but Spretnek spoke in her 1983 Schumacher lecture about the fact that although she saw repeated references to the promotion of a spiritual dimension in green platforms, both party political and non-party political, when individuals are asked to define what they were actually meant by that, she found that this was something that people found it much harder to articulate and to talk about. So nevertheless, she was committed to discovering for herself what such a spiritual component might look like within any green platform, really. So for her, a green spirituality must do several things. It has, first of all, it had to align with her feminism as well. It must honor religious pluralism in society. It should see people focused upon living in place, to know and appreciate the heritage and ecological character of our area, to consider the evolving philosophy of deep ecology, and to think about the spiritual dimension appearing in discussions of global responsibility for the care of our earth. And when I was reading this lecture a few weeks ago, I was very much reminded of many of the themes I think that I see coming up in the work of AE and in some of those kind of Catholic social theorists I was talking about. So for Spretnak, she talks about the fact that her response to these questions was that there was a need to define the spiritual dimension of green politics shaped by her own experiences. She says, I now pay more attention to what is rather than concentrating solely on theories of what might be. We cannot hope to achieve broad-based social change by working only within circles of alternative religion. I'm still attracted to the realm of ideas and visionary possibilities, but only insofar as they address getting to there from here. To be successful, the expression of the spiritual dimension of green politics must present some rather complex ideas in very simple and common sense terms, without watering down the power inherent in spiritual impulses. Again, maybe without having to spell it out, I could see AE really getting some of his work echoing through this. Now, bringing it back to Ireland in the late 19th century, the reason why I think Ireland resonates so much with what's going on in terms of these reform efforts is because it's being catalysed. Is that the Ireland and elsewhere is going through a particular type of crisis after the famine, something that comes to a head in 1879, which is the start of the Land War. So the Land War begins in 1879. It has various phases. 1879 to 1882 is the initial phase, where you have the establishment of the Land League and the Ladies' Land League, first by Michael Davitt and then by Anna and Fanny Parnell, which leads to the creation of the 1881 Land Act. You have the Plan of Campaign then in the mid-1880s, where you see rent boycotts and direct action against landlords. That becomes a more controversial issue. Then you have the various land acts that take place leading up to the 1903 Wyndham Land Act. And the politics of land does remain present, I think, throughout much of 20th century Irish history. I think we're seeing some elements of it play out on the streets of Dublin and places around the country right now. But 1879 is also the year that Pope Leo XIII issues Aeterni Patris, which is his one of his first big encyclicals, which outlines and affirms the fact that neo-scholasticism is going to be the official method of church teaching, which is understanding theology through the teaching of Thomas Aquinas. Now, there are going to be debates about what Thomas Aquinas actually means in various things. That won't be resolved, but it is generative in terms of creating debates. The Land War is also a crisis of the institution of private property, which sits at the heart of Thomas Aquinas' thought. And people like Davitt and Henry George from the United States argue that land should be nationalised as a result. So everything, in a way, is up in the air from 1879 onwards around this institution of private property. It's interesting, Pope Leo XIII thought communism might have started in Ireland, because if you have the disintegration of private property, then that is what's going to unleash these kind of new types of forces. Communism, of course, in the 1870s and 1880s meant something different from what we would understand post-1917. So it's, even as a term to be defined, communism is, it's not necessarily settled either. So there is a church critique that draws on the work of Thomas Aquinas, and Aquinas develops a basis for Catholic thinking on the institution of private property. He says it was a moral necessity. It provided a basis for social order and encouraged the good stewardship of resources. However, he attaches an important proviso to that in the Summa Theologica. He says, man ought to possess external things not as his own, but as common, so that he is ready to communicate them to others in their need. So this then means that there are limits on what one can do with their own private property, and if it's ever used or abused in a way that prevents a satisfaction of the essential needs of the community, it would seem, according to St. Thomas, that the community has the right to assert its claim to such ill-used wealth. So this is around the politics of the common goods, which can also be debated, but that was the interpretation of Father Pascal Larkin, who was the lecturer in economics and business at University College Cork from 1922 to the 1950s. So this was something that was taught in some departments in the country. Rerum Novarum then is Pope Leo XIII's attempt to kind of tread a kind of path between socialism and capitalism to kind of create a Catholic third way. So it's a landmark document in church teaching. But what did it do? Well, it does several things. It recognises the need for the amelioration and reform to counter poverty. It recognises the need for trade unions and the right of people to organise under trade unions. It also sets out the claim, the need for a living wage that will allow families to live with dignity. That's very, very important. But you can see, I think, the echo of the land war here as well, because it also talks about ownership. So the law, therefore, should favour ownership, and its policy should be to induce as many as possible of the humbler classes to become owners, and many excellent results would follow. So this is an important proviso, but what it actually does is shows the church is concerned with things that we wouldn't necessarily, or certainly I wouldn't have thought when I was growing up as a Catholic, around political economy. Vincent McNabb, who is someone who is also energized in terms of his religious vocation by Rerum Novarum. People like McNabb, John Ryan, Father Tom Finley, they have a preoccupation then with the social and economic question. Because what's at stake for them isn't just the character of the economy, it's also the nature of people's souls as well. So one of these Catholic political economists with whom I'm concerned is Vincent McNabb, who's from County Down, but was a Dominican preacher in London, was good friends with Sidney and Beatrice Webb, would have gone round to theirs for dinner every now and then to talk about religion. And he feared that through processes of industrialization, humanity itself was in danger of resembling a machine. This was a clear and present threat in the culture of work by the early 20th century, according to McNabb. And in his essay titled Human Machinery, he argued, there is a danger that industrialism, which has degraded qualitative production into quantitative and has substituted token wealth for real wealth, may arrest the crystallization of peace by seeking everything in the artificial light of the factory, and by stating that even human activity is something that acts in terms of a machine. So essentially, it's stripping away the humanity that belongs to individuals, its being, as was kind of touched upon earlier in a previous session. And McNabb believed that the discipline of political economy had to be one rescued from abstraction and overly scientific expression. As he wrote, I believe political economy is not an exact mathematical science, but is a part of ethics. Its sanctions and moral sanctions, its motive power is moral power. Its results are moral good, are moral evil. And similar to AE, he's concerned with trying to get as many people back to the ideal society, which he sees as rural and in the countryside. And he becomes linked to the movement known as distributism, which he wants to get. And his element of that distributist movement is to get people out of the cities, out of the slums, out of the factory, back to living in the kind of closer to nature, working in agriculture, being out of that urban setting. Anyway, this brings me to Tom Finley here. So I mentioned the plan of campaign earlier, starts in 1886. This is when farmers, tenant farmers, are refusing to pay rents in certain estates. That starts in 1886. In 1887, Father Peter and Tom Finley, both from County Cavan, two Jesuits and two brothers, launch a magazine called Lyceum, which was a monthly educational and literary journal, which remains in print until 1894, when it becomes the New Ireland Review under Tom's editorship. So this journal provides an important outlet for people interested in linking together religious debates towards social, political, and literary matters. So you can see a kind of an earlier version of the Irish homestead here, which Finley was also crucial in establishing back in 1895. The Finleys were both Jesuits, but they were both influential academics. Peter was later professor in theology, and Thomas was professor in political economy in University College Dublin. However, the magazine very, very quickly lands itself into hot water over the Irish land question. So in the second issue of the journal, a series of unsigned articles appeared titled The Theology of Land Nationalisation, which examines the subject of private property and social justice in light of the recent land war. The author was Peter Finley, and he reflected his interest in the ideas of the American land taxer Henry George, which he was familiar with from his time in the United States a few years previously. As I said, George himself is interested in Ireland through his friendship with Davitt and also because of what was taking place during the land war, and he argued that land should not be vested in private hands, but in the whole of society represented by the state, with land possession regulated by a special land tax. Peter Finlay actually attempts to go much further, seeing in George's argument something that is useful but is not radical enough. He argues that George's thinking and morality on the subject seem, quote, singularly weak and inconclusive. Instead, he argues that the right of private property in material things is based upon the jus gentium, which is a kind of form of uncodified canon law based on customary practice. He uses then Catholic theology to allow for the suspension of existent rights of private property and continued, if private property is based upon the law of nations, and if the law of nations, like all positive human law, is liable to be abrogated and repealed by human will, private property can be abolished. Particular social circumstances will no doubt affect the morality of said abolition, but what is desirable as well as valid in one place may be undesirable in another, but the abstract truth must be admitted that the individual ownership is a product of positive legislation and therefore can just as easily be forbidden by it. Basically, private property ownership rights weren't beyond repeal, and if the common good required, there should be changes to land ownership. In the next issue, he goes even further, saying that state ownership of the soil, land nationalisation, if advisable for the common good and decreed by a competent legislative authority, is in thorough harmony with the traditional principles of Catholic theology. Now, this is quite radical. He's kind of slapped on the wrists. He's kind of pulled off editorial duties of the paper. And Tom Finlay essentially has to take over writing the next sequence in the unsigned articles, basically rowing back. So Tom Morrissey argues that Tom basically comes to his brother's rescue, writing in an 1887 December issue that we have not then accepted any new theory from Mr. George. What is new in his theory, the doctrine of the immorality of private ownership in land, we reject as repugnant alike to social philosophy and traditional theology. So this brings it in line with a more kind of conservative but more acceptable face of Thomist thought. Peter Finlay actually resurrects these arguments 20 years later, or 30 years later, near enough, just on the eve of Irish independence, saying that the new Irish state should use the levers of nationalisation. But he's quiet on the issue for about 30 years. Anyway, in the island of Rerum Novarum, there are various things going on. What am I doing? Okay. We have various kind of interventions to try and develop land, and particularly to kind of economically develop the west of Ireland. You have the establishment of the Congested Districts Board in 1891. This is part of a programme of killing home rule with kindness. You have the establishment of the Department of Agriculture under the leadership of Horace Plunkett, which comes out of the work for the cooperative movement. You have the Irish Revival, which has an important economic aspect. And just to give a sense of the poverty that existed in parts of the west of Ireland, places where AE would have been familiar with a few years later as he was organising co-op credit societies. Here you have a report from Henry Doran on the condition of Swinford, which he paints a portrait of a population essentially on the verge of ruin. For example, he notes most of the people in Swinford are more or less in debt to shopkeepers and banks. They seldom clear off the debt. Moreover, these traders have people locked into a debtor relationship and are able to charge inflated prices for the goods sold. So this is the Gone Bean Man, which is a preoccupation in the work of AE throughout a lot of his writing in the Irish Homestead and in the National Bean. You have the establishment of a different type of Christian as opposed to a capitalist enterprise, something like Foxford Woolen Mill, under the leadership of Mother Arsenius, Agnes Murray Bernard in 1892, supported by Horace Plunkett through his role on the Congested Districts Board, and also supported by Father Tom Finlay. So it kind of draws on this new funds that are available from the Congested Districts Board and the state to develop industry. And all loans and payments are paid off by 1910, and it's obviously still in operation going today. But it's important for Tom Finlay because he sees this as a substitute for socialism. So he visits Foxford frequently. He believes the mill represents something of a success, of a kind of a new moral alternative to capitalism. But what makes it significant is the way in which that relationship between capital and labour was organised that was different from other forms of workplaces. So in an 1895 essay entitled The Substitute for Socialism, he compares the success of Foxford with the collapse of another linen manufactory in Carrick-on-Suir. What safeguarded Foxford from a similar collapse, he argued, was that it was not beholden to the whims of capital that might withdraw at any moment in order to be invested elsewhere. Such a state of affairs in Carrick-on-Suir revealed the helplessness of the workers who, at a stroke and from causes wholly beyond their control, find their occupation gone and the weary search for new employment forced upon them. We feel that it would be very desirable that these workers too should have something to say to the movements of capital, or at least that consideration for their interests should enter largely into the schemes which set it in motion. It is a consolation to observe that this more humane and more Christian view of the capitalist duties is taking place in the political economy, which is superseding the gospel of wealth, according to Adam Smith. Now, this new political economy that Finlay was referring to in 1895 was the recently established Irish Agricultural Organisation Society, which was started at the end of 1894 to direct the development of cooperative societies across Ireland under the leadership of Horace Plunkett. So Father Tom becomes Plunkett's number two, and then when Plunkett passes on, Tom Finlay becomes the president of the Irish Agricultural Organisation Society for the rest of the 1930s. Now, cooperation was hit upon for many reasons. The fact is that farmers now, because of the land legislation that's been passed to kind of transfer ownership from landlords to tenants, are becoming stewards of the land, and therefore there's a sense in which they need to maximise the resources. There's frustration with remedial legislation and the paternalism of ventures such as the Congested Districts Board. There's also international competition around the dairying sector. So the Danes in particular have developed dairying around the cooperative creamery. So Plunkett essentially imports that model into Ireland, but it also allows farmers to pool together their rather meagre financial resources to buy this kind of hugely important piece of technology, the cream separator, which completely transforms the nature of Irish agriculture, frankly, from something that's subsistence-based to something that's much more kind of aimed at generating articles for the marketplace. But it also has this moralising aspect. So people like Plunkett, Finlay, Russell, all of them really have that kind of sense in which they're seeing cooperation as a tool to mould character. In terms of the moral economy here, a cooperative is important because it preserves the idea of private property ownership in lines with like Thomistic thought, but it's a private model of ownership that diffuses ownership through that community of interest. So it's a kind of a neat way to sidestep out of that trick between the joint stock company, which is now seen as the traditional kind of capitalist business, but itself was a recent innovation of the late 19th century with this much more democratic vision. You see there the success of the movement. Obviously, societies are distributed right across the country, mainly creameries and credit societies, but also flax societies, beekeeping societies, poultry societies. So there's a wide range of activities going on. Patrick Hannon, who's a young organizer for the movement, delivers a lecture where he sets out what the four key areas, the point of the educational value of cooperation, essentially. First, it focuses on technical questions, but it also introduces people from different backgrounds to one another, different class backgrounds, different religious backgrounds. The IAOS is important as it's shaping the educational climate of organisers, lecturers, leaflets, libraries. It's an important way of disseminating information to the countryside, the Irish homestead being a really, really important part of that. But it's also the moral force of cooperation. So it's value-laden, it builds character, and it teaches through doing. It's a practice. And alongside that, there will be an element of social uplift. Okay, I'm going to maybe move through these few quickly now, just so I can get to AE. I don't want to kind of neglect that aspect of the paper. But one of Plunkett's genius is essentially that he wants to build consensus behind this new movement. Now, not everyone agrees with it. It is disturbing already embedded economic interests, the Gombeen man, the trader, the publican, the people who are loaning farmers money and keeping them sort of tied in a kind of debtor-creditor relationship. the cooperative movement is looking to kind of displace a lot of that. So he's careful that when he's doing that, because people like John Dillon, the Irish Parliamentary Party, are very opposed to the diffusion of the cooperative movement, because they see this economic movement as essentially undermining the farmer base's demand for home rule. They're afraid that if people become materially better off, they're no longer going to desire political independence. And that basically means that the home rule generation of politicians will not get to be the kind of where they hope to be in government. Of course, they don't end up in government, but that's for a different reason from this. But they see plunketism, as they call it, as a great threat to their kind of material base. They bring in Bishop Patrick O'Donnell of Raphoe. He's brought in on the committee. He's initially a big supporter of the movement. He sees it the kind of the value of the moral education, but he later turns on them. But because he's very, very close to John Dillon. In 1899, Tom Finlay, speaking at the Maynooth Union, talks about the way in which the Catholic Church should embrace the cooperative movement. He draws on Pope Leo's encyclical Rerum Novarum as a justification for cooperative enterprise. But crucially, he argues that the cooperative is important for the community and for the individual, and it abolishes the rivalry between labour and capital, because it essentially is turning labourers into capitalists. So it's democratically owned capital is the point. Another young literary figure, Father Jeremiah O'Donovan, is also brought on board. I'll maybe talk about him in any questions after, because he's an interesting case. Anyway, AE is the crucial figure as well in all of this. He was recommended to Plunkett by Yeats as an organiser for the movement in 1897. He embarks on a tour of the west of Ireland as an organiser for credit societies. He's an assistant secretary to the movement in 1899, and then is promoted to editor of the Irish Homestead in 1905. And he essentially becomes a chief propagandist for the cooperative ideal. And he's linking the economic movement to the wider cultural movement, whilst also bringing in something of his own spiritual and political perspective. He's very much influenced by this gentleman, Prince Kropotkin, very kind of widely read anarchist at the time, probably infamous. Particularly the books Fields, Factories and Workshops and Mutual Aid. These two books are very, very kind of well received in the pages of the Irish Homestead. And these books essentially reify the village or the rural commune as the ideal site of political rejuvenation, to kind of create this sort of ideal polity, I suppose, is kind of focused on the small scale rural village. That's where the reform efforts should be placed. Kropotkin also is a scientist. He's an evolutionary scientist, but he rejects social Darwinism and the idea of competition, and he points to the development of the evolution of species as something that shows, that emphasizes the fact that species, animals, humans, non-humans, cooperate with one another in order to kind of make a success of that species, including the human. So it's this, rather than this survival of the fittest mentality, actually the story of evolution is how essentially different species kind of cooperate with each other to kind of bring each other on. And that's the true story of success. So cooperation then is a moral imperative, but it's also a scientific evolutionary success story. So AE's key texts on cooperative political economy come in a flurry from 1909 through to 1916. So the building up of a rural civilization is a speech he gives to the Irish Agricultural Organisation Society when Plunkett is away, essentially reifying the rural commune, the rural village, as a site where a new island should be built. He develops that in a kind of a wider book, Cooperation and Nationality, which is essentially a series of editorials he'd written for the Irish Homestead. But it's really in the National Being, which is a culmination, I think, of his social philosophy in this period. So the National Being starts in early 1914, is when he starts writing it. He's not letting anyone preview this work in the Irish Homestead, really. So this is kind of kept under wraps until it appears towards the end of 1916. So it's his outworking, really, of his time as a cooperator. Henry Summerfield sees this stylistically the best of his books, and it's written against the backdrop of war and appears after the Rising. But it also takes account of the fact that he put his head above the parapet during the lockout of 1913 to 1914. So he's thinking about the great social disruption and political disruption in Dublin in that period of strikes and social disorder. The book later becomes an influence over other thinkers such as Gandhi, but it ultimately is an elucidation of what an independent Ireland could be if it pursues the path of cooperation. So economic democracy is absolutely central to that, and it's the seedbed really of his whole argument within the book. As he says, the book was written about the state of Ireland, its character and future. And as he said, I have here written some kind of imaginative meditation. The state is merely a physical body prepared for the incarnation of the soul of a race. Now, I think the book breaks down into three main themes. That is his consideration of what needs to happen in rural Ireland, also what needs to happen in urban Ireland. So this is where he's trying to link up the consumers and the producers, the labourers and the capitalists, and trying to kind of create a sort of a common bond, a kind of a commonwealth between the countryside and the city. And it's all kind of underpinned by the spiritual dimension that he has around cooperation as well. So he uses this phrase community a lot, and this is also a phrase that can be a bit kind of can be a bit hazy. It's used a lot, but he does define it, thankfully. So he talks about community a lot, but what he means by that is that a community implies an association of people having common interests and common possessions bound together by laws and regulations, which express these common interests and ideals and define the relationship of the individual to the community. So the cooperative society then becomes a space in which all members' interests are tied up together. And the ideal rural village is an organised cooperative community instead of being a sentimental assortment of individual people. A key question he asks early on is, do we want a rural population or do we want a rural community? And this is the difference between the two. The idea that a rural population is essentially a group of individuals living aside one another, many of them having to emigrate, but the idea if you create a community, you create an anchor to the land, and you kind of create a rich social and cultural lifestyle for the people. He's also focused on the fact that the trade of the cooperative is less important necessarily than the work expended on creating what he calls the social organism. So it's not that he himself is, celebrating butter production. For him, that is a symptom of cooperation in one field. The important thing is that practice of people cooperating with one another to build up this thing that he's referred to, the social organism. But it is Irish farmers who have been doing this task for the previous 20 years. But he's mindful that he wants it to move beyond just farming. And he's not afraid of pulling punches. He highlights that there are many enemies to the system. So he talks about the gombeen man, the trader, the middleman. And therefore, he basically says that farmers have to be organised to have complete control of their industry. So there has to be no middleman. The existence of these middle agencies is responsible for a large proportion of the increased cost of living, which is the most acute domestic problem of modern industrial communities. He also argues that we need to have an intermediary body, a federal body that is not the state. It needs to be a voluntary organising body, which is the Irish Agricultural Organisation Society. He also talks about the need for, to put it into modern parlance, what it is the short supply chain and thinking about the appropriate scale for any type of economic activity. So he says we may be certain that any intelligent rural community will try to feed itself first and then will only sell the surplus. It will realise it will be unable to buy any food half as good as the food that it produces. And I was thinking about this through the lens of the Dublin Food Cooperative. So this is an image of Cherry Orchard Community Gardens, which is a place where which is in the city of Dublin, actually, one of the few community gardens in the city. But we get all our things like our carrots, our onions, our greens, our salads, our potatoes from there. one of the things Brexit revealed was how many potatoes that were being imported to Ireland, which is something I found quite surprising, to be honest. But also apples, many of these things that we think and that we can be growing here, we actually don't. And I was reminded of this because of Hugh. I mentioned this last night on the bus, getting a bit sentimental about it. But Hughes's farm, which was a farm in Kilkenny that was in business up until the start of March, was liquidated there last month, and that was responsible for producing an eighth of total carrot supply in the south. So that's 12.5% of Irish carrots kind of just wiped off the balance sheet overnight. So that is doesn't make any sense to me, that. But anyway, AE was basically, he understood that we need to keep our supply chain short, because if it's all about importing things from far, far away, that is a very, very vulnerable place to be. He is writing, of course, at the height of the First World War, where food is a real kind of site of warfare. The other big issue in the countryside, which hasn't really been tackled by co-ops up to this point, is the question of agricultural labourers. These were the people who were emigrating in droves. These were the people, he argued, who had lost the land war, essentially. They were landless, they were badly paid, and they were exposed to seasonal working conditions. Agriculture is and remains a protean industry. He uses that phrase. It's dependent on seasons, it's dependent on climate, weather, timing. So many things affect the kind of the annual calendar, and labourers are essentially waiting for them to be kind of brought in to work the land at this stage. So he argues that labourers need to be full members of the cooperative community. They need higher wages, but they also need to be able to vouch for themselves within the cooperative community, and they need to be able to essentially put themselves up for employment by the community and not be left to the mercy of individual farmers. He also advocates the cooperative ownership of land. That is groups of labourers coming together to run estates, essentially. And he points to this happening very successfully in Italy. It still happens in Italy, in fact. And he sees this as a way to kind of anchor labourers into the rural community and attract more people to come back from the towns and the cities to work on these cooperative land colonies. I mentioned his role in the 1913 lockout, but he's also afraid that workers themselves are subject to numerous unapplied doctrines. So there's lots of ideas and socialism, communism, liberalism that are floating around the city. But ultimately, he argues that labour is servile within the industrial system, and that this industrial system is also separating them from their source of spiritual nourishment. He argues that there's a futility of just chasing higher wages, because capitalists can just reduce purchasing power. So they can pay you more wages and then jack up the price. So to that extent, there is a limited efficacy of the strike, although he does defend the strike as a moral action. He also argues that labour should themselves, like Finlay, become the owners of capital. So to that extent, he thinks labour movements should be focused on driving cooperative ownership over urban businesses, and particularly around production of machinery and various articles. And this, I think, is where there's a chapter in the middle where I think we do get to see AE, the theosophist, come through, because he's kind of laying out all these different issues that need to come to terms with. But at the heart of the debate about a future Ireland is the consideration of the relationship between freedom and solidarity. So this is a perennial question about how does individual freedom flourish. Well, it flourishes when it's kind of tied in and related to a wider community interest pursuing a kind of shared objective. But he puts this in a way which I think is rather beautiful. So he talks about that material nature in which the soul is embodied has the dividing quality of the prism, which resolves pure light into distinct rays. And so on earth we get the principle of freedom and the virtue of solidarity as separated ideals continually at warfare with each other. And the reconcilement on earth of these principles in man is the conquest of matter by the spirit. Indeed, in the last analysis, all human conflicts are the balancing on earth of the manifestation of divine principles, which are the one in the unmanifest spirit. I'm almost at the end. My voice is going, so I realise I've probably been talking for too long. There is a sense, though, in which all of this is linked to the ecology and nature and the planet Earth. So in bringing people to the countryside, he wants to connect people back to the land, back to the countryside and essentially bring Irish people closer to nature, which is the great mother. And the cooperative movement is not just an economic movement to kind of get better prices for butter. It is a vast turning movement of humanity heavenwards. And it's this system of industrial capitalism as a damaging force that is seeing the heavens lose its hold. He says, I believe the fading hold the heavens have over the world is due to the neglect of the economic basis of spiritual life. What profound spiritual life can there be when the social order almost forces men to battle with each other for the means of existence? So just to end this, I think AE and Tom Finlay and many of these people who are energized by the cooperative movement for spiritual reasons, where does their legacy sit today within an Irish, a global economy, within indeed the cooperative movement? Obviously, cooperative agriculture still exists, but perhaps the spirit of cooperation is more present in those smaller cooperatives that are kind of focused on developing these short supply chain cooperatives. This idea that E.F. Schumacher takes up later in the 1960s and 70s, another spiritual economist, the idea that small is beautiful, has a very important environmental and ecological resonance. We do have here in the north community-supported agriculture, such as the Ben Vista Farm, which is an attempt outside the city of Belfast to kind of bring people closer to the land by bringing them in as volunteers to harvest the food that they themselves will be eating. And there are other examples of that. I just mentioned that one as one that I'm familiar with. Food cooperatives as well also shorten those supply chains. So there's Dublin Food Co-op, who I'm repping today here as well. There's Urban Food Co-op, Key Co-op, Carrick Greengrocers. There's quite a few. There should be more, but there are some out there doing that. We also see, I guess, Laudato Si, the papal encyclical put out by the last Pope Francis, reintegrating these Christian ideas of stewardship and ecological thinking and questioning the kind of these imperatives around growth and the need for scaling up all the time. So I guess what I've tried to show is that there is this overlap between maybe the Christian and theosophical critique of capitalism that kind of comes together through the model of cooperation. It's very much embodied in the thought, and what is also crucial, the practice of people like AE and Finlay. They were active people traveling around the country, trying to do the hard yards of getting people to come together and cooperate. And I think this idea of the spirituality of the ecological movement, we can see a lot of the ideas that are being kind of traced and sketched out by AE's work, but particularly that contained in the National Being. Okay, well, thanks for your patience and thanks for listening. So.